לכן אנחנו עוברים לדובר הרביעי, והוא אלי רוזנבאום. אפשר your Hebrew name, אלי? אליהו. טוב מאוד. ואנחנו נציג אותו באנגלית, והוא is the longest serving investigator and prosecutor of Nazi war criminals and other human rights violators in world history. כלומר, הוא כיהן בתפקיד הזה הכי הרבה שנים. עכשיו הם מחליפים שם חוויות. A long-time U.S. Justice Department prosecutor, Rosenbaum served initially as a trial attorney, and למה אני קוראת לאט? הוא שלח את זה באותיות נמלים. And in the Criminal Division's Office of Special Investigators, OSI, מחלקה ידועה, eventually serving as OSI Director from 1995 to 2010. אני עוד אוסיף, זהו. He has been awarded numerous awards. אם אני אומר מה כל ה-awards, הלך לו כל הזמן. ועל כן, בבקשה.
תודה רבה. Unlike Vice President Powell, who spoke so inspiringly, I don't have a good excuse for being unable to address you in Hebrew, so I apologize. Distinguished guests, friends, and especially the loving family members of Justice Gabriel Bach, Zichrono Livracha. Let me also say that it is a special joy to be again in the same room as Michael Goldman Gilad, a hero of Israel and a hero of the Jewish people. I also would like to acknowledge my dear friend of 40 years, Ephraim Zoroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who, among many other things, tirelessly led the legal battle that was described earlier to persuade the Israeli Supreme Court to require prosecutors here to bring John Demjanjuk to trial for his murderous crimes at the Sobibor extermination camp. Footnote, Demjanjuk, as you may know, was sent back to the United States from Israel. We took him to court again. We proved his murderous crimes at Sobibor, for which he was subsequently returned to Germany, where he was convicted of complicity in more than 28,000 murders of Jews. I know from speaking with Justice Bach that he was very pleased with this ultimate result. It's a great privilege, albeit one that for me is a mixture of mostly sadness and yet some considerable joy as well, to speak at this special event honoring the memory, really celebrating the life of a truly towering figure in the history of Israel, the Jewish people, and the rule of law, a year after his passing at the age of 94. The many important honors and accolades that Justice Bach received during his lifetime from governments and organizations around the world are a testament to the fact that his stellar reputation and vast legion of admirers extended far beyond the borders of Israel. As one of his countless overseas admirers, I'm deeply grateful to have been afforded the opportunity to represent the United States Department of Justice today in paying tribute to an eminent jurist who, moreover, is among that legendary generation of pioneers who ensured the historic rebirth of Jewish nationhood in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. Other speakers here today, you've heard from so many of them, are in a far better position than I to describe the extraordinarily broad and hugely important array of contributions that Justice Bach made to law and society in Israel over his long and distinguished career in public service. I'm glad that I've been asked to speak primarily about the one contribution with which I am most familiar and on which Justice Bach's worldwide fame was originally based, his leading role in Israel's prosecution of the infamous Nazi criminal Adolf Eichmann. I first met Justice Bach in 1998 when he was visiting Washington, D.C. As the then director of the Office of Special Investigations, I was invited by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to attend a private, off-the-record luncheon meeting at the museum during which Justice Bach was to address informally a small group on the subject of his experiences in the Eichmann case more than 35 years earlier. As a longtime student of that great landmark in both legal history and Jewish history, it was an invitation that I accepted at once. The experience of being present that afternoon when Justice Bach outlined the pretrial, trial, and appellate stages of the Eichmann case was an unforgettable one. All of us in the room were spellbound as he recounted some of the most remarkable in-court and behind-the-scenes aspects of a case that was, of course, remarkable from its very inception. We hung on his every word, mesmerized by the stories he told and by the moving, powerful, and eloquent way in which he told them. After that day, I was privileged to be in the audience on multiple occasions, both in Germany and in my country, in California, New York, and Virginia, when Justice Bach spoke in his elegant British accented English on the subject of the Eichmann case. And the audience reaction was always precisely the same. His listeners were completely enthralled by his presentation and amazed by his ability to recount events of the trial in minute detail and dramatic fashion as though they had happened only recently. A few years after this meeting, I suggested to the U.S. Holocaust Museum that a program be mounted to mark the 40th anniversary of the trial of the man who had organized the Nazi regime's final solution to the problem of the existence of the Jews. When a museum official asked me whom they might invite to speak at such a program, I immediately suggested Justice Bach and also Peter Malkin, the former Mossad agent who had captured Eichmann in Argentina in 1960. The museum duly decided to put on the program. Both men were invited to participate, and to everyone's delight, especially mine, they accepted. On February 12, 2002, a few hours before the museum event, I escorted Justice Bach to a meeting with a very senior U.S. Justice Department official, almost the most senior Justice Department official. In the wake of the September 11 al-Qaeda terrorist attacks that had taken nearly 3,000 lives in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania just 5 months earlier, the official was eager to learn about how Israel had been able to fight terrorism decade after decade without sacrificing its core democratic values, its commitment to respecting civil rights, and its fundamental humanity. Justice Bach, in the meeting, spoke movingly of his own experiences in Israel's seemingly endless battle against the scourge of terrorism, and he articulated the lessons that he believed had been learned. The U.S. official's many questions were answered forthrightly, and although he, the official, like virtually all of us Americans, was still reeling from the shock and despair caused by the 9/11 atrocities, he seemed buoyed by Justice Bach's confidence that it was indeed possible to succeed in containing terrorism without paying an unacceptable moral price. Regarding the work of the U.S. Justice Department, I should add that I will be forever indebted to Justice Bach for the very wise counsel that he gave me years later regarding one of my office's Nazi cases. Later that night, after the meeting, the largest audience ever to attend an event at the Holocaust Museum assembled in the museum's biggest auditorium to hear Bach and Malkin. The two men treated the standing room only crowd to gripping accounts of their experiences in the Eichmann case. So completely absorbed was the audience in the two men's riveting presentations that when, after more than 2 hours, I, as the moderator, had to announce that we had reached the mandatory end of the program, the museum had to close, hundreds of voices communicated loudly and in near unison their serious displeasure with me as though it were my decision. I could not say so at the time, but I agreed with them. No one wanted this once-in-a-lifetime program to end, least of all me. Justice Bach spoke that evening not only about his experiences in the preparation preparation and trial of the case and the litigation of the appeals, but also of his service during the early period of Eichmann's confinement as liaison between the accused and the Israeli authorities, and also as legal advisor to Bureau 06. It's a measure of Justice Bach's impressive moral character and his devotion to bedrock humanitarian precepts of the British legal system in which he had been trained in England, and also the noblest traditions of Jewish law that he, a Jew who had narrowly escaped Nazi Germany, dealt properly and professionally at all times with the monstrous Eichmann and ensured that the defendant's legal rights were assiduously respected. At the museum event, Justice Bach reviewed in meticulous detail some of the intricate legal and evidentiary highlights of the by then 40-year-old case, and he gave a compelling presentation composed entirely from memory of the elaborate documentary evidence that demonstrated, contrary to the erroneous and oft quoted assertions of Hannah Arendt and some others, that Eichmann was not just a follower of orders as he claimed, but repeatedly instead had taken lethal initiatives in the Third Reich's genocidal scheme to physically annihilate the Jewish people. It soon was obvious to all in attendance at the museum why Attorney General Gideon Hausner had suggested Gabriel Bach from the large pool of experienced and talented prosecutors who'd been available to help lead the prosecution of what was to be Israel's own trial of the century, the largest murder trial in terms of number of victims in history, the only Nazi trial to be devoted solely and comprehensively to the destruction of European Jewry, and the first such trial to be based significantly on the testimony of surviving victims rather than almost exclusively on documents and confessions, as happened at Nuremberg. The responsibility of serving as Hausner's senior deputy prosecutor in the Jewish state's quest for justice on behalf of 6 million murdered Jewish men, women, and children could accordingly be entrusted only to the ablest of attorneys. That prosecutor would have to be a brilliant advocate, to be sure, but he or she would also have to be capable of quickly assimilating vast quantities of documentary and testimonial information in several languages, amenable to working extremely long hours for months without interruption, willing to be immersed unrelentingly in the most depressing and emotionally taxing of subject matters, able to endure that immersion without losing perspective, focus, or humanity, and be prepared to do all of this while toiling in the unforgivable or unforgiving glare of the international media spotlight. Plainly, Hausner's choice of Gabriel Bach was a masterstroke. He had all of the aforementioned qualities and more. Hausner famously opened his initial address at the trial with the words, quote, "When I stand before you, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone. With me here are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point their finger at the man in the dock and cry j'accuse on their lips, for they are now only ashes, ashes piled high on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka and strewn in the forests of Poland," end quote. The 6 million Kedoshim who perished in the Shoah, therefore, found a voice at the trial only through the words and actions of Hausner and Bach and the other dedicated members of the prosecution team and, of course, the victims who testified. In his 1966 book on the case, Justice in Jerusalem, Gideon Hausner had high praise for the performance of his trusted deputy. Quote, "The youngest on our team of 4 was Gabriel Bach, German-born and British-educated. Gabi, as everybody calls him at the Justice Ministry, likes to tell the story of how humiliated he had felt at school in the first years of the Third Reich when all the children were marching and parading while he, the ostracized Jew, was banned from their company. Gabi kept his sense of humor and his composure throughout the full 2 years he worked on the case. I never saw him lose his temper. He was always completely dependable and had soon mastered all the details of the documentation. His great legal talent and organized method of work were an enormous asset," end of quote. None of this is to say that Gabriel Bach was emotionally immune from the heart-rending remembrances of the witnesses and the reports of the savageries set forth in the veritable avalanche of captured Nazi documents and post-war trial records that were delivered to him. To the contrary, it's clear that the unimaginable suffering of the victims and their families affected him very deeply. He was himself a father of young children at the time of the trial, and viewing the Third Reich's crimes through the prism of parenthood made them all the more ghastly to him, as is made evident by, for example, as Justice Rubinstein has told us today, his account of the psychological toll that was taken on him by the testimony of the Auschwitz survivor who told the court of being separated from his family upon arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau and watching helplessly as his little daughter, dressed in a red coat, was swept away in a sea of the doomed, ultimately visible only as a rapidly shrinking red dot in the distance until she and the rest of his family disappeared forever. That testimony, by the way, also left Eichmann's own junior German defense counsel in tears. And Justice Bach and he remained friends throughout the rest of Justice Bach's life. I myself saw Justice Bach once overcome with emotion as he recounted how that testimony, which reminded him of his young daughter Orly, who also had a red coat, overwhelmed him to the point that he was unable to resume speaking in court. The justices promptly declared a break in the hearing. It would not be surprising if an individual who played such a pivotal role in bringing to justice a criminal responsible for the mass murder of millions of innocent people became boastful or at least visibly self-satisfied about such an achievement, particularly when the victims were Jews targeted by Nazi Germany and the successful prosecution took place in the reborn Jewish state. In Gabriel Bach's case, the satisfaction was there, to be sure, and one also detected a sense of pride that the state of Israel's young legal system was able to accomplish what it did in the Eichmann case. However, one searched in vain for any hint of immodesty, or gloating on Justice Bach's part. Instead, one encountered an unfailingly modest, charming, and soft-spoken man. Eichmann's conviction and execution brought an end to what remains more than 70 years later, in Professor Stephen Ratner's words, the most famous and authoritative genocide prosecution in history. As Professor Peter Papadopoulos of the University of Athens presciently predicted just 2 years after Eichmann's final appeal was rejected, quote, in the struggle for the rule of law in the international community, the Eichmann trial will hold one of the most important places as an achievement of justice and a step toward the establishment of international criminal law, close quote. On a personal note, I am everlastingly grateful that fate caused my path and that of my wife Cynthia and our daughters to intersect with that of Gabriel and Ruthie Bach. Behind every great man, it is said, there is a great woman. The truth of that aphorism was certainly proved in the case of the Bachs. Ruthie and her husband both came from Zionist royalty, right? Before escaping to Palestine in 1938, Justice Bach's father, Victor, was a Zionist leader in Germany, where he served as director of Keren HaYesod. Ruthie is the daughter of the famed Haganah leader Yehuda Aratzi, formerly Tenenbaum, whose heroic contributions to the creation and defense of the State of Israel are memorialized in the permanent exhibition of the Ayalon Institute. And while her husband was laboring night and day on the Eichmann case, Ruthie took on, without complaint, principal responsibility for the day-to-day management of family life, and following the case's completion, continued to be Justice Bach's ever-present source of support and love. Cynthia and I feel so very privileged and fortunate to have been welcomed by them as friends. We have been enormously inspired by their courage in the face of hardship, especially the tragic loss of their brilliant and universally beloved Yonatan of blessed memory. We were deeply moved by their boundless compassion, of which we ourselves were beneficiaries at our own time of family tragedy. In conclusion, I must say that I feel Gabriel Bach's gentle, guiding presence as it lives on among us, in those of us who loved him, those of us who learned from him, those of us who admire him, and especially in those of us who struggle to emulate, as best we can, his profound goodness. The memory of this great man will forever be a blessing to the world. Toda rabah. Thank you.